for, I believe it's our second in the speaker series. Herman's background: Herman was born in Haarlem, that's with 2 A's, in the Netherlands, and he was a young child when World War II started, which is what we're going to hear about today. He was drafted in 1955 at age 20 for a mandatory 2-year tour in the Dutch military. Herman served later as a second lieutenant NATO officer, maintaining equipment for communication between NATO countries. And then he moved to the United States in 1965 at age 30 to work for Motorola. So let's have a warm Warhawk round of applause for Herman.
Thank you all for coming to this presentation. I've done it a few times before, but it's still always I'm kind of antsy to do it. So I'd like to start out with introducing you to our family that was born right before the Second World War started. And you can see my parents on the left side. They were still looking pretty good, pretty healthy, but that was before the war. And then myself in the middle of my 2 sisters. The 2 sisters were born in 1939. This is a map of where I lived, where we lived, and in relation to the rest of Europe. I'm going to try to point out some areas. Let me see. Can you see the red dot here? This is the country of Holland. Netherlands, but it is also known as Holland, right here. Very small compared to the rest of Europe. And there is a smaller detail right here, and you can see the town of Haarlem right here, and this is the size of the country. One of the smallest countries in Europe. And Germany is right at the east of the Netherlands. And those were the people, the Germans, the Nazis, that invaded us. And we didn't expect that invasion, actually, because we were an independent country. During the war, 1914 to 1918, we were pretty well left alone by the Germans, the first German war. And so we thought it was going to happen again in the Second World War, but it didn't. And the reason for that was that Hitler wanted to get into France by means of Holland. Go the other way around, that would have been easier for them. And not only that, it was a way to set up a defense for the British people, for the British military, that England was right across from Holland. This is Holland, this is England, this is London right there. So it was much easier for them. So they just didn't care about our independence and went into our country anyway. Next slide is a movie of it, how it actually happened, how we were invaded.
Fateful day, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. Without warning or the slightest provocation, they unleashed upon their innocent neighbor the full terror and fury of a devastating blitzkrieg. The force of the Luftwaffe was revealed to a shocked country. A purposeful army floated relentlessly down from the skies to penetrate hard-held lines of defense. Swiftly, they paralyzed communications and destroyed transportation. There was no stopping this ravaging horde. And when negotiations for surrender had already been concluded, Rotterdam Center was blown to bits, systematically, completely, shamelessly. Bewildered and resentful, the population gathered to read the first proclamations of their treacherous conqueror.
These bombardments started about 5 days after the Germans decided to get into the Netherlands. And the reason for that was the Netherlands wouldn't give up. They didn't want the Nazis and the Germans in our country. So they made it pretty clear by major bombardments. Rotterdam was probably one of the first, but Haarlem, our hometown, got a share of it. That would be the next picture. And this is how it sounded when they flew over our hometown and tried to bombard several areas of it. The left side, you can see Rotterdam. The town center was really flattened out. Nothing was left. 6,000 people died during that bombardment. And of course, a lot of people lost their homes, and it was misery. The one in the middle, you see some of the areas in Haarlem, our hometown, that was bombed. And not as bad as Rotterdam, but enough to give a message. On the right side, part of the backside of the train depot in Haarlem, and was also hit by the Germans. Of course, that's all we could take after Rotterdam, and not just Haarlem, but several cities in the Netherlands were bombarded, and we just had to give in, and the Germans won. Next slide, please. This is how the Germans came into our country, and this is into our hometown. And on the left top picture, and I still remember that, and I still can hear the sounds of the Germans coming in, marching in the so-called goose step. Most of you are familiar with that. And the sound was a sound that I'd never heard before, and it will always stay with me. If you hear that sound, you go right back, as many things that I experience, and I see it here, it puts me back in those times. On the right side, on top, the main square of Haarlem, where the city hall is, and most of the activities. Left at the bottom, you see the stairs of the city hall. The Germans went into city hall, drove the people out, and the people thought, that's it, we don't have a job anymore because the Germans are taken over. But it actually didn't happen. The Germans took over as far as command is concerned, but they still made the people that worked there go back to their job, because they knew all the administration, and they especially knew where all the Jews lived, and the eligible men that could still work for the Germans. So they stayed there for just a year, year and a half, and then it was completely taken over. On the right side, that's very close to where my wife lived and her family, and the Germans came in on motorcycles. So it was in full force, tanks, motorcycles, we knew they were there. And this is how the government ended up. The Dutch government was taken over by the Germans. I'm going to narrate it to you, because there was quite a thing in those days. All of a sudden, we were no longer Holland, we were Germany, in a way, under dictatorship of Nazis. I think there is a distinct difference between a Nazi and a German. And I'm talking that way because I'm talking like I lived in those days. The Germans, many of them were good people, always been. The Nazis were the fanatics, and these were the ones that you really had to watch. We had many experiences with Germans that were quite good, and I get into that later. After the Dutch army capitulated on May 15, 1940, I'm going to narrate this, the Netherlands was occupied, and the government and the Queen fled to London. And they had a good reason, because a lot of people in the Netherlands would say, gosh, that's not very patriotic, and being next to your people in the country that you not control but guide. But after a while, we thought it was the best way, because they would have been killed by the Nazis. Because they would fight back with the military. Our military stayed actually together with our allies during the entire war. But it was good for royalty to leave, and they went to England. And also radio stations, they closed up and they went to England. Because radio stations knew they weren't going to survive, because it only was German propaganda in those days. On the left side, Adolf Hitler, that was part of the plan, and Heinrich Himmler, who was assigned to get a government, a German government going in the Netherlands, and it ended up with Arthur Seyss-Inquart, a very difficult name to pronounce, and he was the boss of Holland. He was an Austrian lawyer, and he was well known for Nazism. He was very close to Hitler, and he became the boss. Needless to say how that turned out. Next slide, please. This is my mother was born and raised in England. Can you imagine being under dictatorship of the Nazis and having English around? Because that's the people they were after. They wanted to get into England for once, amongst other things, but they wanted to get into England. My mother was born and raised in England, so right away, and not just her, there were many people like that. They felt they were spies. They were looking how to get back to the Germans, so it was very dangerous for her. But thank God, to France, she got a counterfeit, I must emphasize, counterfeit certificate indicating her legal presence in the Netherlands. And the Germans, everybody had a card like this that they had to show when the German would ask, show me your card. And that usually indicated whether they were legal or Jews for that matter. Later on in the war, not anymore, but in the beginning it was stated that they were Jewish people, and that's how they infiltrated. Next slide, please. These are the papers that were attached to storefronts, to City Hall, and everywhere where a lot of people would gather. And those were the work notices. In other words, the Germans wanted eligible men that were in good health and fit to work for them. They were picked up and they were sent to factories in Germany for war industry, or they were put to work on the bunkers on the west coast of Holland, but just not Holland. It's called the Atlantic line of bunkers, all the way from Norway north to south past France up to Spain. They built bunkers all around, or not around, on the side of the ocean, waiting for the English to come in. Next slide, please. And here's an example of that. You can see some of the bunkers. These are built in the Netherlands on the coastline, and the Dutch prisoners of war and able men were sent to Germany to work in the war factories or put to work on the Dutch coast for building Atlantic line bunkers. It was massive. I mean, bunkers all over the place, on the coastline. And they're still around. 65% of these bunkers are still around. They're mostly blown over by sand because it's on the beach area and we have the dunes to protect us from water, and they're covered with sand, but there are still about 65% around. And these people that took possession of some of those bunkers bought the property and it came with the bunker, and they made houses or restaurants of it, all for history purpose, so they can say this was a bunker and this is how it looked like. And you can see a few examples of it. Most bunkers had ammo or had guns, like you see on the left top, but not all of them. Some of them were infiltrated by Nazis with guns, and they were ready to hit when the English would come over. Next slide, please. This is a drawing made by the Nazis, and that's I made a copy of an original drawing of the bunkers. I give you an idea. This place right here, you see a little flag, that's where we lived. That's where the house was and where we lived. That's the western part of Haarlem. If you see these round circles, they are all bunkers. And this is where the ocean is, right here. This is all dune area, sand. And that's how the bunkers were built, and it continued all the way through the northern countries, Norway, and all the way south, this direction, to Spain, called the Atlantic Wall, very famous. Next picture, please. Okay, this is not right in the beginning, but about a year after the war started, close to a year. the Germans, or I'm going to talk to Nazis, because the Germans, a lot of them were good folks, the Nazis were not. The Nazis wanted us to turn in everything when it comes to cameras, radios. Cameras, we couldn't take pictures that way, radios. They didn't want to hear all the friendly stations with aggressiveness towards the Germans, so we could not have any radio or any cameras. And you can see that here on the right top, the picture. This is where in our town the radios and the cameras were stashed with loads and stacks of them. No more radio, no more cameras. On the left side, gasoline pumps, they were sealed by the Germans. So nobody had gas for their cars, not even buses, not even taxis. It was impounded, and only the Germans could use the pumps for their need, whatever it is, mostly military, of course. Even church bells were taken out of the towers. The church bells were used for ammo, for bullets, and because that needed a lot of brass and copper. And so there was not a tower in the Netherlands that had still bells that they could ring. If they rang them anyway, the Germans knew where they were, and they were impounded and taken away. So no more bells. Next picture, please. And this is after they closed the gasoline stations, they had a way, or they felt they needed a way to still get around somehow. And here are some of the ingenious ways of getting taxis to go and private cars to go. You can see on the left side are two taxis with a gas bladder on the top of it. And the gas bladder contained gas, and that's how the taxi drove. But it didn't last very long, 3 blocks, and it was empty. So they had to go back for more gas, and after a while that became very burdensome, and it disappeared. They also had a way of moving buses called wood gas. Gas was derived from wood in a special system. Right here, if I can get the pointer out there. Yeah. See, this is a setup how these wood gas generators worked. Wood was brought in a tank right here, and then under high temperature it formed the gas. It was filtered and sent to the carburetor. That's wood gas. Gas was also made out of charcoal generators. But in this case it's a wood generator, and they were mostly used for transport like buses or trucks for that matter. But it didn't last very long, because later on you find out wood was almost impossible to get, and so was gas. That stopped. Next one, please. This was a situation. We lived on a farm area, and we had a V1 launching pad not too far away from us. You can hear that. That's how a V1 sounds. And it was very close to where we lived, and there were several reasons why my dad thought that's not very good here for the noise, because these things were usually launched during the evening times and during night, so very difficult to sleep. Second of all, the English were after the V1 launching systems and tried to bombard it. Can you imagine bombs dropping all around your house? It was just an unsafe situation. And we found, my dad was lucky to find a regular home where we moved to. That was, I believe, in 1942 or so. And you can see from that area to this area, and trying to get away from the V1. Now, moving to a different house is not a simple thing in those days. And the reason for that was, we moved to that house, and we had neighbors, of course, we didn't have before, and they would never talk to us. And actually, my mother told me, don't talk to them, don't talk to them. And the reason for it is, we had in Holland collaborators that were on the Nazi side. That's well known. Thank God, there were not a tremendous amount, but there were enough to cause problems. These people also turned in Jews, and that was, I come to that later, that was also a very bad situation. So we didn't talk to them, and that was the situation. And sometimes not unknown. We remember that, most of you, at the beginning of the war with Japan, that the Japanese people were interned in concentration or in camps in the United States because they were afraid, maybe some of them, they were spies. So we had the same issue until, about half a year after we moved in, or even longer, we heard the neighbors talk about those damn Nazis, and then we knew they were not on their side, and we started talking to them. That's a little story on the side, but you can understand how you feel. You can talk to people. You know why? Well, I was a young kid, I didn't always quite understand, but now I know. Next slide, please. The roundup of the Jewish people. In my estimation, probably one of the worst things I ever witnessed. There's a few more, but this was really bad because there were kids involved also. The kids, the future of everybody's country, everybody's life. And you can see here how that happened, the roundup of the Jewish people. On the left side, you see a picture with kids being ordered by the Nazis. You see the guy pointing a gun right here to these little kids. The kid didn't even know what was going on. Can you imagine the attitude of persons? It's a kid doesn't know, and then handled as an adult and as an enemy, as a big enemy. Outrageous, and that's very painful to watch. The Jewish people were also, Jewish families were separated. Kids and adults, and you can see that here. On the right top, it's mostly adults. The right bottom is kids. Why would they separate kids? Well, the kids thought, well, maybe it's vacation, we have a good time or so. The adults knew better. The kids were not important. The adults were far more important because if they were young and strong, they could use them for their factories and for their war efforts. Kids were not important. So as a result, kids died sooner than the adults. Kids were annihilated right away when they got into concentration camp. They moved them first to a camp, and you see that on the next picture, please. Here you can see that the Dutch Jews board the train in Harlem. They went on the train on which they are transported to Westerbork. Westerbork is a city, not at the time a very well-known city, in the northeast of the Netherlands, also a German concentration camp. But they were not killed in that camp. So they all went to that place, to Westerbork, and they made the separations in Westerbork between the kids and adults. And I can use you, you can use for the factory, the others went to camp. And that's what happened in that city. And then later on, they all went to Auschwitz. That's one of the worst camps that existed during the Second World War. All the Jewish people that were in Westerbork ended up in Auschwitz, nowhere else but Auschwitz. Next one. Why did Hitler and the Nazis attempt to exterminate Jews? Well, everybody probably knows the stories, but I'd like to emphasize it anyway. How bad people can think and how bad people can act. Throughout the centuries, Jews have been persecuted and murdered and forced to flee their homelands. The Jews were blamed for the 1929 worldwide depression, for Germany losing the First World War, which they did. And anything wrong in Germany was all blamed on the Jewish people. Hitler's belief led to the World War and the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Europeans, including 1.5 million children. Can you imagine? 1.5 million children. Next. In the town of Haarlem, where I was born and raised, I was more raised on the outskirts of Haarlem, and this is where this thing happened, the Nazis ordered the residents in North Harlem to leave. We lived in the southern part, not the northern part. Residents in the northern part of Harlem were ordered to leave their homes. The Germans needed a wide field of fire, so their homes were demolished. Obviously, they wanted to put more military there, more guns, more cannons, so they just destroyed the home. Had a lot of ramifications. These people needed alternative living space within 12 hours. No trucks were available for the move. So they used baby carriages, like you can see, all kinds of ways to get some of their belongings somewhere else. Of course, they couldn't take everything from their house, it's just the direct belongings. They ended up in the southern part of Harlem, our area. And we were ordered by the Nazis to open up our doors where we lived. And people from the north would pass it, and if they saw an open door, that's where they had to be. That's where they had to live. And sure enough, we also got people from the northern part in our house. It happened to be not so bad. It was an opera singer that moved in with her husband and was an excellent piano player, but she would sing day and night, and we had 3 children that had to sleep. But anyway, we could accept that compared to a lot of people with a lot of issues. That was not an easy task for many people. Not only finding the places to stay and to sleep, it's also food, because they didn't bring any food, they couldn't bring any food, so we had to come up with that. It was really a struggle anyway you see it. I don't know the intensity too much of it, but my parents surely did. Next slide, please. This is an announcement that was put, well, we didn't have newspapers anymore because we had Nazi newspaper, and they were spread out all over the place, of course. We acted like we couldn't understand German, so we couldn't read what it was saying. But these things were posted on City Hall, on a lot of stores, and it says you can no longer listen to radios, because they knew darn well that some people didn't turn in their radios, they still had radios. But they were ordered not to listen to the radios, because they listened to stations in England, the Dutch radio stations, that was fighting against the Nazis, and the Germans didn't want us to hear that. So we were forbidden to do that, and we could only listen, and they knew darn well there were still some radios around to the German stations. If you were caught with a radio and listened to that station, you were shot. No ifs, ands, and between. You were shot. If you were listening to a German station, you were a good person. These were the announcements. I copied that in English, so for people that want to see what it really says, but that's what it meant. You could not listen to the radio. Next, please. This is a crystal radio that my uncle and I built, and I talk about that later and explain it to you. Can't understand it, eh?
Ik herhaal, van Bob voor Jan, blijf op de plaats waar je bent.
And this is the actual sound from the Dutch radio station in England, and it was called Radio Orange. And you can see that. And all that was needed is an antenna and ground for a crystal radio to make it work. And my uncle was a technical genius, and I was kind of his favorite nephew. I had to help him building a crystal radio. And that's the radio. You can see that how it was built and how we used it. We used it on our attic where we lived in the new house, so to speak. And they had sheets on the side, and we cut a hole and got behind these sheets of wood and then we listened to the radio because we were on top, easy antenna, and we had ground there. And we listened to Radio Orange, and we heard some news that was going on. It was talking about what the Nazis were doing in the Netherlands, and what to watch for, and where to stay away, especially for infiltrations, neighborhood infiltrations, and I talk to you about that later. So we heard that, and it was transmitted by a Dutch reporter that talked in English. And this was done to send codes and orders to people that were resisting the Germans. And there were, thank God, several of them. And they got messages like, Bob, go away, stay where you are, you don't have to go anywhere else. That was just said here in the Dutch language. But it didn't mean that at all. It meant something totally different. And the people that worked against the Germans in Holland knew exactly what that meant, and they could act accordingly. That was the only way that we had some communication with the Dutch side, the Dutch government, the Dutch military, if you will, in our country. None of those people were there anymore. Next, please. Now this is called the razzia, and I was just talking to you about that. That's an infiltration. Germans, again, I need to say for this thing, Nazis would come into a neighborhood unannounced. You had to open up the door, and they had free entrance to your house, and they looked everywhere. And they looked for eligible men, so they could pick them up and send them away. And they also looked for Jewish people, if there were any Jewish people around. And they would stick, and that happened when they came to our house. We had a couch there, they had a gun with a bayonet, and they stuck it right through the seats on the couch, because they thought maybe people are hiding underneath the couch. And that's the way we got infiltrated, and it was called Russia. Now you see on several pictures that a lot of people were caught that way. On the left side, eligible men and Jewish people. On the right side, that was a miserable event, and that could happen unannounced, and not just one, sometimes 3 times a week, sometimes none in a week. You never knew that, so you had to be very careful, especially when you're part of the resistance and you were hiding Jewish people, because a lot of our people in the Netherlands that belonged to the resistance did this kind of work. They were hiding Jews, and then they sent the Jews later on to other places where it was more safe for them. There was an internet of moving and people, Jewish people moving around. And especially people that were strong enough to work for the Germans. They didn't have to be Jews. My father was also picked up. My father-in-law was picked up to go to Germany and to work for the Germans in the factories. My father was picked up with his brother, the youngest brother, and he was a daredevil, my father was not. And they got on the train, and my uncle, my youngest uncle, told my father, we're going to jump out of that train. My father said, are you kidding me, break our legs? He said, yeah, but if we continue, our life will be gone. And he pushed my father out, and my uncle also jumped out, and they made it back home. And when they got back home, of course they only had to move at night. On daytime it was easily to catch. When they got home, they had to hide pretty well for the rest of the war, because they knew the Germans were after them. I saw my dad once in a while, but most of the time he was gone, of course. Later on, after a while, I found out where he was hiding, but we couldn't see him. My father-in-law was also picked up with a family member of his, and they got to Germany, and they were put to work for the German factory. My father-in-law was very lucky. He made it back, but his companion couldn't make it. And these were the things where the Germans were after, to get able-bodied and Jewish people, of course, to get rid of them. Next, please. Young boys were used by the Nazis. Terrible. The Nazis had created two organizations for young boys. The Deutsches Jungvolk, for boys between ages of 10 and 13. 10 and 13, think about it. And the Hitler Youth, ages between 14 and 18. Many Dutch boys, starting at the age of 10, were used towards the end of the war when they got really desperate. A lot of kids between the ages of 14 and 18, in the beginning, it was actually the beginning of the Hunger Winter, were picked up by the Germans to work for their goal. Maybe not necessarily as a military person, but to work for them in any other capacity. And that happened a lot. Towards the end of the war, kids, closer to 13 I should say, were actually used to fight for the Germans in the war. Kid doesn't even know what it's all about, but they were used. Not as frequent as the olders, but when they really got desperate towards the end, that was happening. You can see Hitler there, these young kids there. Hitler would slap them on their face and you're a good boy, and they felt very proud, of course. It's a young kid, you know, you do something good according to somebody, you feel very good about it. But it was a terrible situation. Here you can see some more examples of that. Jewish boys offered to serve with the German military to escape death. This happened, I would say, quite in our hometown, actually quite a bit. There were Jewish families that for some reason survived. They had kids and they had boys, and that's what I'm talking about, because what they did, what the parents said, why don't you, when they at their age, why don't you go to one of the officers, the German officers, and tell them you want to fight for them. You want to be a military person. And they figured that is a way to save them, because if they do that, they have a better chance of survival than just trying to hide or to run away. And I've seen Jewish people run away. In my neighborhood was infiltrated by a razzia, and there was a Jewish family in hiding actually, but I knew some of the kids, or one of the kids, a boy that I occasionally played with. And we had a razzia, and they ran and they were shot at, and you can understand the results of that. It wasn't very good. But that's the way it happened during these razzias. So young kids were involved in it, and again, I have a hard time with that, to accept that young kids were used for something like this. Can you imagine? It was the same with me at the end of the war. I thought the war life, the life that I led, was normal. That was the life, not normal, you know, a lot of things happen. But that was the way life was. And in order to change, it's awfully difficult. It takes a long time, and some of the things never disappear. But can you imagine the young kids that go through that? Some of them made it. They got out of the German military when the war was over, and they were still alive, but others didn't. Next slide, please. The start of the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter started in 1944, and that was probably the worst year of the entire 5 years. And the reason for that was, many of them, and you can see in the following slides, the reason was, first of all, the winter was extreme. It was the coldest winter on record in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands and Holland, or Holland in those days, it was a pretty cold country. We did a lot of skating and we had a lot of snow. That has changed over time, but in those days it was very cold. It was the coldest on record. Not only that, we didn't have the heat. I talk about that later on. We didn't have the food, because there was no food for a number of reasons. I explained that to you. The Dutch famine, also known as the Dutch Hunger Winter, started in September 1944 and ended a few days before the liberation. The Nazis had cut off food supplies to the western part of the Netherlands in retaliation for the exiled Dutch government supporting the Allies. The government that was in England supporting the Allies, of course. A major part of this retaliation was the railroad strike to help the Allied invasion of the country. So they were planning on an invasion, and we wanted to help the Allied by stopping the train so the Germans couldn't go from one end to another, but it actually was a mistake. The Germans had their own train drivers and trains. Next slide, please. Here is an explanation of the railroad strike that was going in the Netherlands during that time. In September 1944, the Dutch government in London calls for a railway strike in the Netherlands. The strike must stop the German troop transport because the Allies want to carry out airborne landing near Arnhem for Operation Market Garden. That's what it's all about. Unfortunately, the result of the strike is disappointing. Also because more than 30,000 railroad employees had to hide because they couldn't just move around. The Germans would know it, and that was the end of their lives. So they had to be in hiding. Unfortunately, the result of the strike is disappointing because the Germans used their own trains and personnel for the troop transport. The shutting down of the railway network also makes the distribution of food very difficult. And that was the result of the hunger winter. And those are some of the announcements we had before the hunger winter started. The text is kind of small because I had to copy it from a placard that was normally attached to stores in the city hall. But a few things about it. In September 1944, gasless hours hit households. Gas to cook on and to heat a house. The gas company will only supply gas between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning and 11:30 and 1 o'clock at night. September 25, that was very shortly after that. Can you imagine this? The toilet may only be used in an emergency, and watering the garden is completely prohibited. What we try to do is, in that time, food became very difficult to get. We started a few vegetables in the backyard. We also started to raise a couple of rabbits, just to keep us fed, because we knew it was going to be even worse. And a lot of times we wake up in the morning and it's gone. And it's not only that the Germans took it, because they were hungry too, but also our own people, because if you're hungry and you can't move because you're so hungry, you take whatever you can get. That's a result of that. October 19, gas was completely disconnected. No more heat. Next, please. September 17, 1944, like we just talked about, a railway strike was called by the Dutch government. The strike was to stop transport of German soldiers to an advance of the Allies. We suffered from severe cold and lack of food. To survive, we ate things like flower bulbs, sugar beets, and even pets. And that's no story, that's really what went on, because there was nothing else. Children were sent to the countryside by their parents. We had a lot of farms in the area, in the hopes they would be fed. Some of the farms, maybe they had a little food to share. And that's what parents did. 22,000 died from malnutrition and another 50,000 from infectious diseases due to lack of medicine. Not only food that we didn't have, also medicine. So a lot of kids died, and adults, and especially senior adults died because of no food and no medication. Next, please. We always carried a spoon in our pocket, hoping to find some garbage cans with leftovers. If we went out on the street or going someplace, my mother always made sure that we had a spoon in our pocket. Because the lack of food, and really there was nothing, the lack of food, you try to find it wherever you can. And in our neighborhood we had a school where I used to go to that was occupied by the Germans for their offices and their kitchens. That was just a 5-minute walk away from us. And we knew that the food was cooked there for the military, the Nazis and the Germans. And they would pick up barrels of food and bring it to the soldiers, and later on brought those barrels back and put it on the sidewalk near to that school. And we were there waiting for them. And we had our spoons in our pocket, and we opened the lids, we took the lids off, and we scraped every possible piece of food that we could find. And sometimes our mother gave us a pan, a small cooking pan. If you find any more, put it in the pan so we can have something to eat also. That was not unique, it was common in those days. Most people suffered that way. If you were on the side of the Nazis, for some mysterious reason, you always looked more healthy than the rest of us. And that's how it was. Nothing left. You can see some pictures here, and on the left top, you see a little tiny stove. We call it the wonder stove. And some Dutch people found out if you have small cans, and you could still find them in factories or whatever, you could make a little stove out of it. And the stove had a few functions. It was very small. It was about 10 by 8 inches, and put wood in it, and it gave you some warmth. The family sat around it to get as more heat as possible. Not only that, if you scraped some food or you gathered some food elsewhere, you put it on top and warm it up a little bit. That was the only means of getting food, if it was there, and staying a little warm. But it didn't last either, because it used wood, and wood was gone in no time because everybody did the same thing. Next slide, please. Here, some examples of those stoves for cooking and keeping warm. The only source of heat and a way of cooking were small pots, about 8 inches by 10 inches. The fuel needed for them is wood, which was very hard to find, and people would tear up railroads to retrieve the wooden ties. Because in the town of Haarlem, we had a tram, a trolley, going around on tracks, and of course there are wooden ties below that, and everybody knew that right away. That's where you could find the wood. So that's what we did. We tore up the wooden ties and used it as firewood, which was not without danger because it had a lot of tar in it, and that was not very good to inhale. But it was warm, and we sat around it, and we could keep some food warm that way. The fuel needed for them, like I said, is wood, which was very hard to find, and people would tear up railroads to retrieve the wooden ties. Backyard fences were already gone. They were used to at least create some warmth. Because the end of September, beginning of October of 1944, they announced that there would be no charcoal, coal, that we used for our stove in the olden days. No electricity, no gas, you're on your own. So that's how it all resulted. Every time I see food wasted, my mind goes back to 1944 again. And that's only normal. Because you still move yourself back to these times. When I watch TV and I see Ukraine, I'm right back in the Netherlands during the Second World War. It doesn't stop. So when I see food wasted, I'm right back to that time. And I think, oh my gosh, I wish we would have that in 1944. I understand because we get these tremendous portions of food, and that's the American way, and I'm very thankful for that. Absolutely, no doubt. But it's personally. I see it, and I see it wasted, and it kind of down deep inside hurts when I see that. So that's just a note on the side, but you can see what happens when there is no food. Several people we knew didn't make it, especially little kids, seniors. You can see that the suffering that goes on. It's amazing how bad it was. Operation Market Garden, that's where we had the railroad strike for. Watch this clip.
An air train wings toward the Eindhoven-Nijmegen area of Holland with supplies and reinforcements following initial landings of the 1st Allied Airborne Army. Dropping supplies just south of Nijmegen. Here, airborne infantrymen are engaged in securing important bridges and flanking the northern anchor of the Siegfried Line. During the entire Netherlands airborne operation, American planes and gliders alone carried nearly 6 million pounds of supplies and equipment. The following scenes were made with a camera strapped to the chest of a parachutist.
This is how I saw the skies when that happened. It just happened a few miles away from us, towards the direction of Arnhem, and there was a sky full of parachutes and airplanes. And that's also what went on.
A heavy concentration of anti-aircraft fire brings further losses in Allied planes, indicating a vigorous attempt on the part of the enemy to stem an Allied drive north from Nijmegen.
That was a common sound also during the war. Operation Market Garden was not a success all the way around, and I'll explain you next. This is part of the Operation Market Garden that involves gliders. And I wanted to show you that because we have one of those gliders sitting out here, part of it. But very interesting to see. This is a little thing about the glider. Was an American glider, a WWII glider. It was built here in the United States, and it was very, very good during the Operation Market Garden. It didn't really ended up the way they wanted to, but it could store a jeep or a small tank. Several people. Was amazing what it could hold. And they were pulled by 747s out of England, C-47s, not 747, C-47s out of England. And they were let go close to our hometown to fly to the area where the Market Garden was concentrated, the action. Next slide, please. Some facts about the failure of Operation Market Garden. I'm not sure how many people have heard about Market Garden, but it was a very big event during the Second World War. The plan failed largely because of the Third Corps' inability to reach the furthest bridge of Arnhem before German forces overwhelmed the British defenders. And you can see that on pictures after that. You see all the bridges down and all the areas, all the roads were bombed except one bridge, and that was the important bridge because the Nazis were there. They had the Panzer divisions there, and they annihilated a lot of soldiers on our side. Some positive results of the operation. Anything negative always has something positive. You just have to look for it. And I found it liberated a part of the southeast Netherlands from Nazi occupation. It did that. But it was a very small village, and that village was liberated. They really didn't see any Germans anymore as the first part of the Netherlands before we got total liberation. But that was the first one. We thought in the Netherlands that's not going to last, but it did. It did last. Established a foothold for the Allies to make incursions into Germany, also very important, and it did that. And then third, showed courage and determination of the Allied forces, and that was great. So it has some positive points. Next. I will not talk with that, it's a very important one. My mother was 78 pounds after the war. We got food, and this happened close to where we lived. There were many parts in Holland, but this one, Schaap in particularly, was the west coast of the Netherlands, close to Haarlem, and we saw these packs coming down, and we as kids ran to it with the adults, trying to gather it. It was an amazing thing, and I was informed there was nothing that could kill you. It was food, and with the cooperation of Sweden, England, the United States got it together. They even got an agreement with the Germans not to shoot on these airplanes, and it didn't happen because it carried food to needy people, and they flew at about 2,000 feet up, not higher, because these food packets were not attached to parachutes. They never would open. So they dropped the packets about 1,000 feet, amongst other things, because radar. There were still Germans that didn't know about it. They could have shot these airplanes down, but it didn't happen. We got the food. There were two such operations in the Netherlands. and one was called Operation Manna, and it happened a week before that. That was done by the Canadians, and English and Australians also participated in that. That was more the southern part of Holland, with the same result. We got food. Dutch resistance, that was a very important part during the Second World War, because without them the disaster would have been even greater. And these were honorable, fantastic people that would fight for everybody's survival. And how effective was it during the Second World War? Though 107,000 Jews were deported out of Holland, the Dutch resistance was able to put 25,000 people into hiding, 16,000 of whom were undetected. That's still actually pretty good. And that was thanks to the resistance that they were hiding them and moving them from place to place. I talked about that earlier. In addition, some Jews refused to help the help that was offered to them, believing that being deported gave them more of a chance of survival than going into hiding. They were wrong, of course, but they thought that's maybe a good way to stay alive. If we cooperate with the enemy, it wouldn't be as bad as they catch us in the fact and the act and we get killed. But it didn't work. Next slide. These are part of the resistance in the town of Haarlem. And I honor these people still today. What they did was amazing to save a lot of people, Jewish people, the majority, but also other people that were sought after by the Germans, and also some people with disabilities. People with disabilities that were not people that could be used for work, they were also annihilated alongside the Jewish people. But they thought they would make it that way, but it didn't happen. These are the three people that I honor tremendously. The first one is Corrie ten Boom. A lot of people here in the United States have heard of Corrie ten Boom. And she was Dutch, and my wife Johanna and me, we talked to her a couple of times in the Netherlands, because she lived there in our hometown, in the town of Haarlem, and that's where she was hiding the Jews. In the house that you see in the middle was a clockmaker shop. Corrie ten Boom was a clockmaker by trade. And so they had this house. They had an extension built in the back there for the purpose of hiding Jewish people. And she did. And she would hide them for a certain time and move them around, because that was the key to move them around. It was harder to catch them. And that was done all along. Move the Jewish people around. She is really an example of that. She was caught with her sister. Her sister Betsy was her name, and her dad was also a watchmaker. Caught just before the war ended, was sent to concentration camp. She made it, but her sister and her father didn't make it. She came back and spent some time in the Netherlands, several years. And that's the time when I saw her in that house. It was not far away from us. And she later on moved to the United States to preach the Bible. She was a very religious person, and everything she done was because she was a religious individual. That's Corrie ten Boom. That's the house where she was hiding. Then we had Hannie Schaap. She did the dangerous work. Hiding Jewish people was very dangerous too, because if you get caught, you were dead. But she did, Hannie Schaap did even more dangerous things. She was a member of the Dutch resistance and gathered final reconnaissance information, assassinated Germans. That was a very, very dangerous thing to do. And Dutch collaborators, we had them too. They were on the Nazi side, they were on the German side just to save their own body. Without any thinking, they figured that's a safe way to do it. Of course, they were caught also. And she was executed just a couple of days before the war ended. Didn't know for sure that the war would end, but she was killed, shot to death, close to where we lived in the dunes, and it's now still in a memorial area where she is buried. Next, please. Is all the misery going to end soon? Well, in the beginning of the war, I was in a school off and on because visiting schools and learning it was not on a continuous basis. It was most of the time too dangerous to get out. But if it was kind of a good time, then we would go to school, get some lessons. Most of it was done by your mother, you know, homeschooling like we see today. And that was the majority of it. This was a school, part of it, anyway, that I was in, and then later on had to leave because of the war. And it was also taken by the Germans for their offices and their kitchens. And I talked earlier about that when it came to the spoon. The food was made there and the offices were used, and that's where we found the cans with food and we scraped it. But when I saw that, the Allied came in. These were, I believe, Canadian soldiers, and they infiltrated the school for Germans still in there, Nazis. And there was nobody. And when we actually saw that, we thought, liberation is near. When that happened, we knew the Canadians were here. They were the first ones in our area. Then the Americans came with the Australians. And we knew that was just about the end, and it was. Next. Liberation. That was a day we never forget, of course. You can see all the festivities of that time. If you look at this here where the red dot is, no, it's here, right here. That's me. That's me on an American truck. And just happy and driving with them. It was a big honor, and a lot of people did that in those days when they came in and liberated us. We'll never forget that. The parties lasted for a couple of weeks. Everybody was just so excited. You see another one. Dinners were put up for kids, and the food came from the packages, of course, and we saved some of it together to honor the kids, because kids went through a lot in the Second World War. You know, it's not just the hunger, the cold, everything else, but also their mind was infected so much, because they grew up with a miserable time that they thought, well, down deep inside that must be life. So they were honored there, and they were shown how it can be, how it really can be. Next. That makes sense to me. I still remember, after the war, I heard everybody say, never again. True. Everybody was saying, never again. Did we learn anything? Look at it today. Therefore, I wasn't a good volunteer to do these talks because it creates memories, but I feel it's so important, especially those days when you see so many atrocities, almost equal to the time I went through and what happened between 1940 and 45. If it can be a little example of what can happen, maybe we start thinking a little deeper about it. Next, please. Some statistics. I don't want to read it all, there's a lot of statistics. Why was the Netherlands occupied by Germany? I told you that earlier, because the Germans wanted to go over Holland to get into France, to occupy France was an easier way, and also build footholds in case the British would invade the Netherlands or the entire west side of Europe. And that's one of the reasons. There's more in there, but anyway, it had a lot of things why it happened, the way it did happen, and ultimately we would say its power, it is respect, and that's kind of my mission. I feel if we can create more respect for somebody's opinion, unless it's very dangerous, that's a different story, that would help a lot. Because there's just no way we can all think alike, and most people have the best interest in it but see it differently. We got to have more respect for that. That's my mission in this whole thing. Next, please. This is the hardest for me to watch.
Just 7 miles from the city center of Maastricht is the Netherlands American Cemetery. A tranquil landscape masks the country's turbulent history during World War II. Over 8,200 Americans are buried here, their headstones set in long curves. They gave their lives in the Allied struggle to free the Netherlands, easternmost Belgium, and then invade Germany itself. Private Walter Wetzel smothered the blasts of enemy grenades with his body to save the lives of his comrades. The memorial is of white Portland stone. A sculpture depicts a mourning woman flanked by hovering doves and new growth from the shattered remains of a tree. It represents new life sprouting from war's destructions, proclaiming man's immortality and hope for peace. Walls in the Court of Honor bear the names of over 1,700 missing in action. The bronze chapel doors depict a tree of life. Inside, an illuminated crown of the Netherlands hangs suspended from the chapel ceiling. Since 1945, the cemetery has had a special relationship with local people. Many bring flowers. Some adopt the graves of those who are buried here. This is their gesture of lasting thanks to the Americans who fought to liberate the Netherlands.
And we still do that today.